Hey, it's the SGG Podcast. We're here with the podcasters. Say hello, podcasters.
Hey, everybody. Peter Lawrence here.
Hello, Chad Jettner.
And I'm Kyle Bacher. And today we have a few special guests. We've got Mark VanDriel, who is the head of a few of our practices. And I can't name them off the cuff.
There's so many you can't name them.
Yeah, so he's one of our practice leads. And then we've got Shawn Imholt, who works in the DevOps space. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad you could be here.
Glad to be here.
Can't wait.
So today we're going to talk about, I guess the best way to say it is, I spent too much on the cloud. Oh no, what do I do? I think an early promise of the cloud was maybe cost savings. I don't know, but now that we've had it around for a while, maybe not so much anymore. So, we're talking about cloud projects. I guess lift and shift comes to mind, migrating to the cloud. Maybe you guys can tell us a little bit about, like, starting with that kind of project. Why isn't it cheaper? Why doesn't it cost pennies on the dollar?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of people over the last decade have dipped their toe in the cloud. Some may be full body in the cloud, others may be toe. But I know, certainly, back starting probably 5-6 years ago now, there was kind of this concept of, boy, I got to get out of my data center. I've got expiring hardware. I've got reasons to move. And I'm just going to go toss it all in cloud because it's supposed to be cheaper. And what they really found out is that, without some changes to the architecture and the way they do things, it really isn't cheaper. And while it can give you some flexibility and certainly, provide you servers and capabilities a lot quicker because I don't have to go install hardware and software and all that. Like I can wire it for myself. Ultimately, the bills were high, right? And I know there was a research done by Gartner a number of years ago that said that 80% of the organizations that embarked on this, didn't achieve cost savings, and that's not a shocker, right? The big realization, and I believe that a lot of larger players that have devoted more capital to making this happen or more expense actually to making this happen, probably have learned those lessons. But a lot of the mid companies are going through that right now with their first foray into the cloud, and it's really kind of a scary little effort because, like with anything in business, if you fail the first time over, it's hard to get the go ahead to do it again. And there's really a lot of good things to come from cloud. So, Shawn, I know that you've kind of lived in the wild and seen this before. Do you have some stuff to add to this?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe to talk a little bit about why, or to echo a little bit about what your comments were as to why companies would approach their transition to the cloud in a lift and shift kind of manner, is that they tend to make decisions in a data center focused, type of organization in like years. So they have to do planning for next year. They have to make that decision that they need to get out of their data center on, December 31st, or they got to pay for the whole next year, Right. So, okay, well, AWS provides tooling, that allows you to perform that lift and shift action. But, once you get there, that's where the realization of that you need to change from a CapEx focused model to an OpEx focused model. Whereas in AWS, if you're always primed up to your largest production workload throughout all your environments, then shockingly enough, your bills are going to come back, a lot larger than you expect, even though your utilization is really low. And those don't
you mean
matter.
Paying for top end machines running full blast all the time isn't cheaper?
Shockingly enough.
That's crazy.
And right sizing is a big problem out there. And again, AWS does try to give you some tools to give you visibility that, you're not utilizing these services very well, because they want to provide all these services to everybody. If people are pulling in, all this compute power and not utilizing it, then they can't sell it to the next person and they have to charge more, and everything just creams on from there.
It is kind of fun to see how aggressively AWS tries to lower your bill for you if you're listening, right? Through things like reserved instances and spot instances, all these opportunities that they give you to, like, hey guys, like, really, you don't need to be spending this money. I promise you it'll be cheaper if you just tell us what you're really going to use. Yeah, they aggressively push all of that tooling. I remember seeing that last gig, and being surprised, like, not really understanding like what their motivation for, aside from just being an awesome partner, what their motivation was for, like, so aggressively trying to get me to spend less money with them.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of it is they don't have to build out as much infrastructure for themselves if they can convince people to use the amount of infrastructure that they actually need, right? You don't have to build out more data centers if you're only using a quarter of each data center, right?
Yeah, and I think it is kind of anti-pattern, right? So as in the software industry, we're used to people just trying to sell us more software all the time. Hey, buy a bigger license of this. Oh, I bet you need another 100 of those,
Right.
And our cloud platforms are smart enough to know, what, like, you got to use this responsibly. And I believe that, if you trace back to old time IT, you're buying servers, you get that cost hit your books, you get them set up, and you just kind of forget them. You don't even know who's using that server. You don't know what devs are using that server. You obviously know what production system is, but when you get to cloud, like, you got to pay attention who's using the servers, because guess what? They can get them really quickly, right? Hey, I need a server to test this new feature. Okay, I'm going to do it. And you know what? I really know Peter's super responsible, and he's just going to get rid of that server as soon as he's done. Guess what? He doesn't. And you get that monthly bill, and you're like, what are these other 30 servers we just added? And it's really changing the game for IT leaders to looking and watching their usage, daily or for sure weekly, to try to get on top of those trends before that monthly bill hits them. And cloud providers know that the way to be successful is to try to help companies make that, emotional change around how to manage your platform.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you went from slow dimes to quick nickels for cost, and now it's not even nickels; it's fractions of pennies for, this level of usage, and like you almost have to have like a new role in IT that's a cost admin or cost expert that can stay on top of like all of these different costs, because you don't know, like, when you're setting stuff up, because I kind of took on, as a new admin and a new service admin for two different big cloud platforms, you kind of cross your fingers anytime you do anything. Like, is there some way that this is going to cost me a ton of money over the weekend that I don't know about? Is choosing this particular database product on this platform going to cost money in ways I don't know? And how are we going to manage that? How are we going to manage different developers using different systems? What happens when they don't need it anymore? How does it get shut off? There's a lot of different factors now that didn't exist before. So I remember early days of the cloud, when you're trying to sell people on like Office 365 and things like that, you won't have to maintain the same infrastructure. You don't need the same number of people. It's going to give your IT people more breathing room to do their other parts of their job. And IT people were kind of worried about it. Like, if I'm a sysadmin, am I going to lose my job when we go to the cloud? And sysadmins became service admins. And now you're not a developer as much as a configurer of things. You're not writing as many scripts. You're just kind of learning the ins and outs of the platform and what boxes to check. But how much does that knowledge matter when you're starting out to make sure you start off on the right foot? Shawn, how much of your job now is calculating costs?
Yeah, I kind of smirked when you mentioned that, so that, and there's kind of two aspects I'd say about that when relating to cost and like kind of business function, but definitely in the exploratory side, I do a lot of cost estimates, and that's just you make all these assumptions and you plug them into a spreadsheet, and a number comes out, but then you throw your caveats out there that, this doesn't really, say this is what that service is going to cost, and that's kind of more the estimation and trying to determine, what kind of cloud services that you want to utilize to solve your use cases. But then there's also that other part that you mentioned, Kyle, where, there needs to be guardrails, of some sort that are built around your company's cloud usage, such that you don't have those kind of fast bleeding of nickels, like you mentioned, so that just, and another point you mentioned is how the sysadmin job has really changed. And it really has, and it's drifted, more towards a development type of methodology, where you're using these services in such a way, not necessarily creating scripts to update virtual machines. You're using this, configuration management tool to, remotely manage your 1,000 servers, and you're writing YAML, that type of thing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add to that. There is a movement occurring out in the marketplace. We're starting to see a little bit of it, and it's called FinOps. And FinOps is really around solving that financial side of the equation, because it is real. And I know from my past, I remember the shock and awe on my face when I'd see our cloud bills, and we go, hey, we're going to carve it down this month, and then only to find out that, the developers, we put, terminations on our servers, right? And to find out that our offshore developers actually put keep alives, pinging the servers to keep them up so they'd never time out and never be destroyed, And here I was expecting a big savings. There's no savings. And so you get into all kinds of interesting plays around that cost side, and it's a really big deal. So go ahead, Kyle. I know you were going to comment on top of Shawn's.
Yeah. Well, I think that, there is ways of putting controls in place, and like I've got budgets set up, so at least I'm alerted when.
I was going to say the alerting has gotten a lot better, right?
Yeah. But again, I don't have the real deep understanding of like what all the components are that we're using and what they do and what that means in terms of CPU and storage. If you think about where you're getting dinged on cost, it's really around how much of their stuff you're using, how much of their storage, how much of their processing power, how much of their bandwidth. It's kind of all based around that, like kind of real world costs. Some things, just to have the thing idling will cost you $30 a month. It's like, oh, we're not even hitting that thing. And yet, because it's turned on, that's costing you. And then it's what are the alternatives to that? There's a different number of different database solutions in these different cloud platforms, and there's a number of ways of doing things. I wish I knew them all and I could talk about them in detail. What I do know is that what I discovered is it's service management. You're partnering with a cloud provider, and you don't just get everything. You're buying a video game, but you don't have the expansion pack. You haven't hit all the levels and unlocked all the levels and unlocked all the characters. And like you have this starting point where it's like, okay, we're getting this, but we really don't have true backups. We really don't have this level of security. We don't have MFA turned on. We don't have like all these things now we have to do and turn on, and some of those things have a cost associated with it. Some of it's a per license cost, some of it's kind of a usage cost, but everything across the board in all of these cloud services seems to have some kind of a cost associated with it, or there's kind of minimal use free versions available as well. Somebody's gonna say, yeah, go ahead.
We kind of talked about this a while ago, Kyle and Peter and I, as developers, what are we doing with all the free time that we have been given because of the cloud, right? Like, that's not really a thing. We're just diverting our attention to other things, right? So
2 words: koi pond.
Koi pond, yeah. I'm spending more time in Dogecoin right now, but the there it just your responsibilities shift, and you know, we were talking yesterday about production disasters, and one of mine was I have an example of, you know, low-level MySQL configurations. Well, that stuff doesn't exist anymore because you have the conveniences that RDS gives you, right? Like, you don't have to set up your own read replicas anymore. You don't have to do any of that. You just, you know, you configure it and you go. But the productivity improvements that conveniences like that give you, it still doesn't seem like those improvements are fully realized in other aspects of what we do, right?
Yeah, I would go back to kind of how we started this whole conversation around lift and shift, really. And it's really hard to lift and shift to the cloud and be successful, right? There is a level of refactoring that needs to happen. And it is really whether you choose to go fully more of like cloud native architecture using all cloud services, or you retain some, you know, more traditional kind of architecture in mixture. Without leveraging those services and really getting to a serverless platform, it's really hard to get the savings. And you know, we hit briefly on the data side, and I know Shawn has definite thoughts here too, but that idea that I just have one massive data store for everything isn't very cost effective, isn't very usable. It's really kind of parsing that across the needs for that data and how you consume that data to try and save costs. And I think it kind of hits on, Chad, what you were saying, right? Which is it's a really truly aligning at yet another lower level, your architecture, to leverage the best scenarios on a given cloud platform. And it's not simple, and you're not going to get it right the first couple times. And you just, you know, you're just hoping you get enough rope and you can show enough savings to continue that journey. Shawn, you probably have stuff to add to this one too, would be my guess.
Sure. Yeah. And, you know, Chad, it was funny the way you put it, you know, like, what am I going to do with all this free time now that we're in the cloud and, you know, everything is done for me, right? You know, it's a similar, you know, misunderstanding to, oh, we're not going to need, you know, an IT or an infrastructure team any longer. No, we moved to the cloud. Like, no, that job just changed, you know. And when one of the things that the cloud does allow you for is that, you know, kind of building blocks approach, you know, where you can kind of pull in things as you need them. Like, you know, for example, if you want to make a communication or some sort of process asynchronous, you know, you can just create an SQS queue and have that infrastructure ready for you, you know, in a very short amount of time compared to, you know, times when I was a developer and I didn't have any building blocks. You know, I had to negotiate and you know, have a whole another team build a block for me, you know, and then possibly in Q3 be able to start to use it. You know, so it really just kind of changed the way that, you know, you approach things.
So as a developer, maybe there's less between you and like there's fewer barriers because the speed at which you can spin up these solutions, and you know, the fewer people that you need to involve in that process. You know, it sounds like the management piece of it, the cost management piece, all of that stuff, it's difficult enough that there's cloud providers out there that will tie into your cloud services and help you manage your costs and create rules. And I looked at one early on. I can't remember the name of it, but we were too small to really benefit from it. It was going to cost more than we were spending to look at anyway.
Right.
Save $10 by spending 20.
Yeah, exactly. But for every one of those things, you know, I talked to Travis Blanton, another one of our DevOps guys, and he was like, yeah, for every one of those things it does, you can do that, you know, with scripts and other ways. You know, you don't need that big do-it-yourself kit. All that stuff is built in. There's ways of tying into all of it and setting that all up. You know, how much, I guess, how much of that time do you spend on these projects setting up the bumpers and cones and all those guides to keep people from coloring outside the lines and keep that horror story we've all heard from happening where something got left on over a weekend and on Monday the bill was $1 million. You know, what are you doing anything right now, Shawn, to kind of build those barriers, those limits?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways, you know, that I've seen companies approach that, I guess. You know, some, you know, really try to lock down the services that development team can utilize. Most of them really solve that in a similar way that you have with, you know, aggressive monitoring and reporting of when costs, you know, would shoot out for an unexpected reason. You know, but you also don't want to err on the side of, you know, once again, we came to this environment with all these building blocks and now you're telling me I can't, you know, use half of them, you know, for whatever reason, you know. So I think the most successful, you know, places that I've been at, you know, self-empowered dev teams tend to be the higher performing dev teams, you know. So
yeah, freedom.
So, freedom, exactly.
Autonomy. Yep. You know, those are really important things for creative people and developers and stuff. So how do you have that within, like, so you have a ceiling, you have autonomy, but you have a ceiling. You have, you know, it's kind of like you have the rules of the road, but you're not telling people how to drive or what vehicle to drive. So they still have the freedom. You're not telling what route to take, but you still have to have stop signs and stop lights occasionally to prevent bad things from happening. How do you know where to set those limits and how to do that?
Yeah, you know, and to prevent bad things from happening, you know, is a good way to put it, right? You know, and you want to, you know, again, kind of make yourself aware of what the dev team is doing, you know, and also provide those guardrails in terms of monitoring and alerting. But you also, you know, want to encourage them to take risks. And, you know, when we encounter a problem, then we, you know, provide the appropriate solution. And maybe that's some additional tooling to have some more lambdas that, you know, monitor some additional activities, you know, but generally the best case scenario is you build these things up as they happen. And, you know, if your company is going to go down because a developer spent $1,000 over the weekend, then you probably have got other issues.
Yeah. I think oftentimes it gets back to dev process. You know, I have seen it in organizations that have been, you know, more like a SaaS provider where they have multiple clients. And if you don't have a very organized dev process and you need everything available to you at all times, you're going to spend a ton on cloud. And it really bakes back to how do you, you know, so many things bake back to how do I organize work? How do I ensure that I don't have to work on everything in non-prod environments at all times? And, you know, I've seen non-prod environments be 70% of spend, which is absolutely off the charts insane. But it can happen if you don't have a dev process and you're completely off the rails.
We looked at, you know, how would we set up So we had a lot of people getting certifications and things like that on cloud products. And we looked at, what kind of development environment can we set up? How are we going to provision accounts? How are we going to put barriers in place? And it really kind of came back to what, as a company, if we set up an environment and somebody makes an error, leaves something running, and all of a sudden it's $100,000, are they going to forgive us? Versus if one of our developers on their own sets up a version of it and is goofing around with it and does something like that, what's the forgiveness going to be from the cloud provider? And after a lot of conversations, it seemed like the likelihood of that forgiveness was pretty high on the individual side, but a lot lower on the company side.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was the speed at which people wanted to get into it and start using it was such that we just said, you can expense the cost, but set it up on your own and be careful. And that was kind of our development footprint. But if I was an enterprise, then I would be looking at one of those tools to provision accounts, deprovision stuff, monitor things, automatically shut things down if they get out of hand. Some things, like if you want this type of thing turned on, there's going to be a request, because if you're going to be scrubbing through hours of video and putting it against AI to determine, facial recognition, and it's terabytes or exabytes of data, that's going to cost some money. Now, maybe you have business justification for it, and your end result, your product that you're going to get out of it, it's going to end up paying the costs of it. But before we turn that on, we got to be careful, and we got to have some limits in place. What other considerations are there with, we've been talking a lot about cost, but, it's not just one cloud platform. It's like AWS, or you might be using AWS, Azure, and then some of these other one-off smaller tools or online applications, things like that. I know we use quite a few. Is that another consideration? Like, is there a benefit to try to put everything under one cloud app or build everything under one thing? Or do you just kind of go where the savings are? I think
both, right? So there's considerations, and I think that's really the conversation today, is all the things you need to think about. So I'll even trace this back to egress charges. If you're a multi-cloud platform and you've got a data hub that requires a lot of data flowing, and you put the apps that create that data in other cloud platforms, and all of a sudden now you're just shipping data over. You can just get nailed in egress charges, right? And so it really, it's not as simple as saying I want to stay multi-cloud platform, so I'm going to have 3 of them, and I'm going to kind of round robin which ones go in which platform. There's an awful lot of considerations on data flow and usage and architecture that really needs to fly in when you're making those decisions. I can't, and then really, if you can estimate, Chad talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Like, if I can estimate what my usages are, getting to reserve instances, right? That saves me a lot of money. And so there might be some benefits of thinking about your architecture that way. And man, I'm going to have like most of my reserved instances here, and I'm going to do most of my spot stuff over here. It's really a complex game of considerations and placement and architecture. And we've even seen things like, do you know that you pay extra per transaction if you send it to China? No, I would never guess that. Well, you actually kind of do. And so you need to think about little things like that. And that might be one case for one cloud provider, but the other might be free. Right. And so it's really a balancing act. And I think you have to balance autonomy versus vendor lock-in, versus overall cost profile. And the thing I'll say, I want to make sure I hit this point. Huge fan of cloud. I think it can just add a ton of agility to a business, and it just needs to be executed right. That's the key.
I was going to say two things, Mark. The one, I mean, to your point about agility, as a developer, and we kind of touched on this early on, like being able to go to a cloud provider and being able to prototype darn near anything instantaneously, like that's
right.
huge. That is compared to what we had to do, Peter, 20 years ago. Oh,
yeah.
I want to play with, I want to play with a messaging server, and I want to play with this, and I want to play with this. Well, okay, that's a day and a half, 2 days to set up IBM's MQ server or whatever the heck, right?
If they have the hardware on hand, and then you got to wait for that if they don't, and that has to come in. And
so the ability today to prototype solutions and to be just ridiculously productive out of the gate is for a developer, that's the dream come true with the cloud, with
trial
cloud
and error. Yeah.
But then the balancing that against folks trying to be relatively platform agnostic, right? Like today we've got the benefit of containers, and we've got the benefit of all of these layers of obfuscation between us and the implementation. So we can be relatively cloud agnostic, right? And I don't know how popular that is. My focus has been AWS since AWS was a thing, since the dawn of time in 2011 or whenever the heck that started to become a real
started.
thing. Yeah, yeah. I've always been kind of AWS focused, hyper focused on AWS. I haven't putzed as much with Azure or even Google Cloud Platform. But I have noticed currently and previously an actual push to try to be relatively agnostic, which precludes you from using some of the very specific tools like Lambdas, right? Like a Lambda isn't as portable as a Docker container deployed to a Kubernetes cluster anywhere, right? I don't know if you guys have seen that too. That's me just lobbing a softball.
So does that make cloud lift and shift a little bit easier?
Yeah, I mean, dropping a container anywhere absolutely makes that relatively simple. And taking advantage of, like I said, taking advantage of all the layers of obfuscation that we have between the implementation of whatever cloud provider we're actually deploying to and the code that we write tactically. Like it's easier now. I'm not going to say it's brainless, but it's an awful lot easier than it might have been a decade ago, right? Like, or not even a decade ago, 5 years ago, right? I was I had deployed a thing via OpsWorks, right? AWS's version of Chef, and it was relatively portable, but not without an awful lot of rework. AWS kind of made their own specific changes to the Chef infrastructure that you had to take into account, and moving off of it was hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's trade-offs to every decision, right? And some of the examples we talked about is just like running like a Docker container or running a virtual machine, and that's ubiquitous, right? That anybody can do that anywhere, but by not going down that more of a utilizing some of the cloud services, some of the fully managed services, you're maybe not quite getting the benefit that you're getting from this cloud provider, in that, especially when it comes to cost, in those services, you are paying directly for your usage, as opposed to providing that compute power, all the time out there. So it's just a different way to look at it, I guess.
Yeah, trade-off.
Yep, exactly. Trade-off to every decision.
So what are the big surprises you've seen in terms of cost, since you began your cloud journey, Shawn or Mark? things that you were kind of surprised were going to cost as much as they were, or even things that you were surprised they were as cheap as they were?
Yeah, all these estimates I do, the biggest cost driver is almost always the data. The storage of that data, the processing or moving of that data in and out of the database, and then moving data, in and out of, your APIs, and the number of transactions, the size of those transactions are big drivers of cost. So it's the data is just always getting in the way.
The data is getting in the way. The thing that was eye-opening to me, and it's probably because I'm a technology dinosaur, right? But like, I remember the days of Oracle and Golden Gate to do all the replication, and what you can do with, for instance, an Aurora Postgres on AWS is just amazing for the cost profile, and spread it regionally. And I mean, it is so cheap compared to the old days. It's amazing what is available for you to do if you do it right and manage it right, and how quickly and how cost effectively you can do that in cloud. It's just, for an old school person like myself, it's just absolutely nuts.
So do you ever find yourself in a situation where cost structures or the way the stuff works dramatically changes and becomes more costly because you don't have complete control over what they're doing on those cloud servers and with those products? So you're kind of at the mercy of the cloud provider. So all of a sudden you chose this particular database and it was like $5 a month. And then they decided that, no, that's going to be $25 a month now, or data is going to be this much per megabyte or whatever.
I mean, I'll do my air quotes and say I have not. So I'm really interested to hear what the other guys say, because I haven't seen it so much on the air quote cloud native, cloud servicey kind of databases that cloud offerings are kind of based on. I have seen it on traditional database platforms that are offered on cloud providers because they're trying to steer you away from a platform. I got cooked by a very large database company on that very reason. And I understand the intent for it, but made it super painful to use their product, so much so that we moved away from their product. But has anybody else seen that with data products, like massive changes?
Well, two aspects to look at that from, right? From the provider, side. So I have not seen that from AWS, at least, as of yet. They all the cloud services provide pretty much the same thing. They're all competitive price-wise against each other. So, the kind of hoodwink, kind of scenario is usually not part of working with AWS. But then the other side is us. How are we utilizing that service? And, once or twice, assumptions that you make in a project prove to be wrong,
Right.
shockingly enough, right? So like now we're into a space and we're looking at, oh my God, this is crazy, huge bills. We need to pivot. So then just like in any other agile, iterative process, we recognize that there's a problem. We find an appropriate solution to maybe use a different, type of storage service. Maybe we're storing big files and we should be storing this in S3. But we pivot, we utilize a different cloud service, and we, resolve that problem.
I suppose that's that's the agility to be able to do that now, has made it possible to have that as an agile process. And just the number of options you have.
Well, yeah, imagine the old days where you would invest 6 or 8 months in infrastructure build out to get to a certain place and then realize that it either underperforms what you were expecting or some other difference of operation that you weren't expecting. And the pivot is not exactly pivot as you think about it. It's more of a slow turn to another, better method. Whereas cloud, you just pivot and you just it's not just snap your fingers and Mary Poppins makes it happen, but it's pretty quick, right?
Yeah, it definitely changed the time frames for doing those pivots.
How much, like with network performance, server performance, the cloud infrastructure, kind of where they've gotten to. It seems like that's just in the last 5 years gotten like way better. I have a few people that are using, pretty low power laptops to do development on, because they're doing their development in a cloud VM. And, I had someone ask me, like, is that even possible? Are they going nuts waiting for, the text editor to catch up and all this stuff to happen? And I haven't heard any complaints since then. So it seems to me that, now you're back to a dumb terminal days with this stuff, because the performance is there.
VT100, woo!
Yeah.
AWS, I mean, they have their own cloud IDEs now, and I can't quantify specifically, network performance, latency, all that stuff. All I know is that I don't think about it anymore. That's how good it's gotten. It's gotten so good that it's just an afterthought that things are going to be available. So,
yeah, it only has to be faster than the user and just work.
Right.
And you're good.
And the fact that these days that is just an assumption that we make is how good it is, right? And that's a very nice thing to say about these guys, is that we don't even think about it. You did your job so good. You're the Toyota Tacoma of cloud providers. You just work. You're never going to break. I could put cereal milk in the gas tank and it would still start and you're still working. That's what these cloud providers. I've done that, Kyle. And
I'm just wondering, like, are you a drink the cereal milk person or throw the cereal milk away person?
He's not recommending it in your Tacoma, by the way.
For me, it depends on the cereal. Just to clear that up, so we can move forward.
I gotta know now.
Yeah.
I'm saving that one for later, Kyle. Which cereal is the save and which cereal is the throw? But we should talk about cloud instead.
Yeah, tease that for the next episode.
Yeah, that's right. Come back for the next one and see which cereal is which.
We might get there, where that's the most interesting topic we can think of.
Ever.
So, are you seeing kind of a front runner in the cloud game? Is that obviously AWS, or is I don't know how competitive Microsoft Azure is with AWS. I know I used to think that, Burger King was big competition for McDonald's until I saw their actual numbers on a chart. And I think the bar for Burger King was like just a sliver next to this giant McDonald's profit. But, how big are they? How big is AWS? Is that?
I think it's, I believe it's probably a regional question. I do think it differs by region across the U.S. I know Minneapolis adoption, for instance, has been a little slower of cloud in general. I used to work with a firm out in the West Coast, and they were quite a ways ahead in adoption cycles from where we were in state. It's also hard to tell because you don't know what goes in the numbers when they say, hey, this is how many people are currently on AWS versus Azure versus other things. And and the outlier with Microsoft, because we do Azure work too, right? Like we're doing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What I don't know is in their total counts, how much of that is Office 365 and extensions to that versus true blue dev. And I've looked at trade regs. I've tried to really get an idea, and you don't know. I do know from our market perspective that we see more AWS than anything, but I also know that we're actually working in 4 cloud platforms. I know right now. We're actually doing some Oracle cloud as well. So so it's probably more prevalent. Those kinds of that in GCP. I mean, there's a number of companies that have kind of moved to GCP now. But right now, from a SDG perspective, we see a lot of our clients doing AWS stuff.
Yeah, and we go in with an open mind. We don't bring our agenda in with us. It's what's best for the client.
Right.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I don't know that there's an instance where. Well, actually, there is one. I know of one where we kind of chose a cloud provider for a company, but it was a startup, right? I think most of these organizations that are established already have a direction, and we just try and make that direction work for them, right?
Yeah, like if it's a Microsoft shop, and they're already familiar with Azure AD and things like that, it might be, it just makes sense to stay within their expertise. From a DevOps perspective, how easy is it to hop from one to the other?
It's not. Just to give you a one-word answer.
It's not a Java to C# hop or something like that.
Probably not that extreme, but all your APIs are different that you interact with to manage these servers from an infrastructure perspective, and then even when you're using those services, all the APIs are different. All written in all your favorite languages. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. So you will, depending upon how you use the cloud, you'll pay a converse penalty to switch to a different cloud, right?
Okay.
Right.
So choose wisely.
But they are all very closely and very aggressively pricing to each other, right? It's not Cadillac and Chevy. It's Cadillac and other Cadillac and more different Cadillac, and
Yep.
They're all similar priced.
Exactly, and they have a lot of parity for their services, as well. So, you'll find what you need at both of them.
Right.
What works best for you.
And as far as what works best for who, I think this is an assumption that I'm making, but I think a lot of that is driven by your choices in tech stack, right? Like, I'm a Java guy.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Java guy, I don't know that I would necessarily think of going to Azure, right? That it just doesn't seem to make it's not a leap that I would make, right?
It's not top of mind, right?
It's not top of mind. But as a .NET guy, Peter, would you would probably think the opposite. Right?
Exactly.
I'd start there and go
right.
there. So
I'll look at both, and then this one will probably speak to me a little bit stronger.
Yeah, right. So as if a company has a specific direction with their tech stack, they might, that's going to influence. I mean, if it were me, if I were making decisions, that would influence more than the cost, right? Like, I wouldn't force, something down a path where it's going to be pain either way.
Yeah, the irony of that is that if I look at the last 2 years, and when I say sizable, like just overall importance to organization, amount of value on an app, and quite frankly, the amount of dev effort for an app, like the biggest ones we built have been .NET on AWS,
Right.
Which is also kind of weird, right? Like it was kind of unexpected, but we're getting more and more used to that. That old paradigm of what used to be open source, which also doesn't make sense anymore, versus Microsoft, is kind of slowly falling apart, which is good to see. It's kind of nice to see it all. If you've been in the game long enough, you've seen this happen a few times over.
Right.
As some of us on this call, or maybe most of us on this call have. It's just another rendition of the same song.
It seems like they're all doing a fairly decent job of playing well together. Like, I'm using right now. I did a report. It took me 2 days because I'd never done any of it before, but I did a report that is pulling data from SharePoint and Salesforce, and transforming it in several queries, and then displaying it. And I did that so fast. It's like something I never would have known how to do or been able to do. And I didn't have to write a lick of code. And the tie-ins were all there. All the plugins were there for me. It was just, and the list of stuff available that you could tie into. It seems like everybody's throwing an API out there. Everybody's throwing like different plugins. Some platforms seem tighter than others.
Always.
But it seems like it's fairly open. Like Microsoft Teams can connect to a lot of different apps. Power BI had a giant list of data sources in there. I know that there's a way of doing single sign-on in AWS with Microsoft.
Yep.
So you can manage your identities in Azure, since you're doing that anyway for Office 365. So it just seems like they're playing. It's a little bit nicer out there, instead of everybody kind of being like this with their stuff and closing it off.
There aren't nearly as many walls as there used to be. That's for sure.
Yeah. Any gotchas? Any last minute parting thoughts, Shawn or Mark, that people should take away from this before we shut her down?
I guess I'd say there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? It is the AWS is as you use it. It's not going to solve all your problems.
It doesn't magically make your bills go to zero or anything like that, right?
Right, but it can transition your organization into a totally different thing.
Yeah,
long-term savings, right? Long-term ROI.
Long-term ROI and agility, I think, is the big one. I mean, I keep saying that, but like it's a big deal if you really adopt it. I was going to say my big advice is really measure twice, cut once. Think about your solution. Don't just like chuck it over there, because you're going to be horribly disappointed. If you are going there, think of ways you can optimize it, and think of the things that really need agility in your business and build it for agility. And if you're worried about lock-in and you want to go a little bit more traditional architecture, stay away from cloud services in some areas, then do it. That's fine. Just know that what that means from a cost perspective and a time out the door perspective, because you'll pay for that. But that's okay. That might be a really good business decision. Just think before you act. It's kind of the big thing.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think we'll shut her down. That was the SDG podcast. Thanks for joining us, Shawn and Mark. Thanks for being our special guest today. If you want to drop us a line, shoot us an email at thepodcasters@solutiondesign.com. Until next time, say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.